Mercy General's ER corridor hummed with the white noise of fluorescent lights and the distant beep of monitors from rooms she'd never entered. Danielle Ross moved through the 6 a.m. shift change like water, finding the lowest point, present but unnoticed, her scrubs pressed with hospital precision, her shoes spotless despite the 12-hour rotation she'd just finished. The badge clipped to her pocket read D. Ross, RN in plain black letters. Nothing else. No certifications listed. No credentials. No hint of the 17 years she'd carried the weight that now sat quiet in her shoulders, invisible in the way only someone trained to be invisible could manage. She'd chosen Mercy General in Raleigh deliberately. A mid-sized teaching hospital in a city she'd never served near, where no one knew Navy SEAL Medical Corps, where no one asked questions, where a nurse was just a nurse and nothing more. The obscurity had felt like mercy for the first 3 years. Now it felt like the only thing keeping her breathing at night. The supply room smelled of sealed plastic and the chemical bite of industrial antiseptic. Danielle pushed the aluminum cart toward the locked cabinet where the controlled medication sat under double seal, Dilaudid, fentanyl, midazolam, each vial logged and counted with the precision she'd learned in a place where one miscounted dose could cost lives. She'd counted these drawers 847 times in 3 years. The numbers never changed. The inventory always matched. Except now. The phantom codes had started small. Equipment requisitions that didn't match actual deliveries. A $4,200 order for cardiac monitors that arrived as a $1,800 shipment but carried the full price tag in the system. Billing codes for procedures never performed. The patterns were obvious if you looked, and Danielle looked because muscle memory made her look. 17 years of reading operational intel had trained her eyes to catch the discrepancies others missed. The kind of discrepancies that meant someone was siphoning money from the hospital's cardiac care budget. She knew who. She'd been looking directly at the name when she realized it. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, the ER medical director, had been signing the requisitions for 6 weeks now. His signature sprawled across each form with the confidence of someone who'd never been questioned. His corner office on the 3rd floor overlooked the parking lot and the city beyond, the kind of office that came with administrative power and the relationships that protected you. Danielle had seen that exact architecture of influence before, seen it in commanders who'd traded honor for convenience, in officers who'd learned that rank was better than right. She didn't report it. That was the decision that would define everything that came after, though she didn't know it yet. The supply room door swung open at 6:11 a.m. Hargrove entered with the casual authority of someone accustomed to occupying space without asking. His tie was silk, his shoes Italian leather, his watch worth more than Danielle made in 4 months. He moved past her toward the controlled medication cabinet as if she wasn't there, as if nurses were fixtures like the fluorescent lights above them, permanent but not real, functional but not seen. "Morning, Ross," he said without looking at her. His voice carried the thin courtesy of someone being polite to the furniture. "Morning, Doctor," she replied, her own voice flat as measured water. Deferential. Small. The voice she'd built for this place, the one that made her invisible. She stepped back to give him space, a micro-gesture of deference that had become automatic, the practiced humility of someone who'd learned that staying quiet meant staying safe. Her hand moved to organize the supply cart in front of her, her fingers steady on the sealed packages even though her left hand carried its own quiet tremor when it wasn't being used. A physical memory. A souvenir from Marja that she'd learned to keep still. Hargrove pulled the medication log toward him and ran his finger down the recent entries. Danielle watched the motion in her peripheral vision, her body angled away from him but her attention fixed on the exact moment his jaw tightened. He saw it. He saw that she'd noticed. The recognition happened in the space between 2 heartbeats. His eyes moved to her. Found hers. Held them for a moment too long. In that silence, something shifted. She watched him process what he'd just understood, that she'd seen the discrepancies, that she'd checked his work, that she knew. Not that she'd said anything. Not that she'd reported him. But that she knew. And he could see the knowing in her eyes like a seal stamped in red ink. Danielle looked away first, back to the supply cart, her movements mechanical and precise. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Somewhere in the distance, a heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm, indifferent to the transaction that had just occurred in the supply room of a mid-sized hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hargrove reclosed the medication log with a soft click. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He'd learned what mattered, that the quiet nurse at the supply cart had seen behind the curtain, and now he would have to decide what to do about it. He left the supply room at 6:51 a.m. Danielle continued organizing the cart as if he'd never been there at all. But her left hand was trembling now, and this time it wasn't the tremor she usually managed. This was something new. This was the moment when a decision to stay quiet stopped being a refuge and started being a risk. She didn't know it yet, but that tremor was the beginning of everything. The system had been warned. The quiet nurse had registered. And in the physician station 3 floors above, Dr. Hargrove was already thinking about what happened to people who saw things they shouldn't see. Bed 12 in the trauma bay had been empty all morning until 9:32 a.m., when the transport team wheeled in Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb with a chest wound that had started as a construction accident on a civilian job site. He was conscious but barely, his breathing shallow and controlled in the way of someone trained to manage pain, his eyes moving across the ceiling with the precise focus of a military operator taking inventory of exits and threats. Danielle was the nurse assigned to him by rotation, which meant she was the one who'd seen his name on the intake form first. That name. That specific name. Lieutenant Colonel Webb had been the commanding officer of her son's first deployment. The man who'd mentored Jason through his early missions, who'd sent emails home when he could, who'd promised her over coffee in 2016 that he'd keep her boy alive. He'd kept that promise. That counted for something. It counted for everything. She hung his for fluids with steady hands while his eyes tracked her movements. Recognition flickered there. He knew her face from Jason's photos, from the FaceTime calls he'd supervised, from the way Jason talked about his mother. But he was too medicated, too focused on breathing, to place her completely. She didn't introduce herself. Didn't explain the connection. Just moved through her clinical responsibilities with the same quiet efficiency she applied to every patient at Mercy General. The hospital hierarchy had a specific shape. At the top sat physicians with their credentials and their administrative access. Below them, nurses. Below that, everyone else. Danielle had chosen her place in this hierarchy deliberately, somewhere in the middle lower registers, visible enough to do her job well, invisible enough that no one asked questions about who she was or where she'd come from. She'd been perfecting the invisibility for 3 years. But now the visibility was starting to crack. Hargrove had seen her see him. And somewhere in the building, the man who'd saved her son's life in Kandahar province lay in a hospital bed with a chest wound, unaware that the quiet nurse changing his dressings carried military credentials he would recognize if she ever spoke them aloud. She had no idea that the next 72 hours would shatter every careful boundary she'd built. At 2:15 p.m., Danielle sat in the break room with her lunch, a salad she'd prepared at home, consumed alone at a corner table while the other staff members occupied the larger space near the vending machines. She ate with the kind of disciplined focus that suggested she was fueling a machine, not nourishing a person. Her left hand rested on the table beside her tray, and she watched it carefully, consciously releasing the tension that wanted to live there. The door opened. She didn't look up. Hargrove entered with 2 residents trailing behind him like planets orbiting a sun. He walked directly past her without acknowledgement, but his presence left a wake of awareness that she couldn't quite dismiss. The tension in her hand intensified. That wasn't a request. It was an announcement. He'd made his decision. She could feel it in the way he'd walked past her, not avoiding her anymore, but marking territory. The quiet nurse had become a problem, and problems required solutions. Danielle finished her salad methodically, each bite measured, each swallow controlled. She'd been trained to eat under fire, to maintain caloric intake when adrenaline wanted to shut down her autonomic nervous system. This was nothing compared to that. This was just a break room in a hospital in Raleigh, and she was just a nurse eating lunch alone while the world moved forward around her, unaware that the ground was starting to shift. She would have 48 hours before the system began its response. 48 hours before Hargrove started his campaign in earnest. 48 hours of borrowed time before the hospital she'd chosen as a refuge became something else entirely. But in that moment, sitting alone with her salad and her trembling left hand, Danielle didn't know any of that yet. She only knew that she'd made the choice to stay silent, and that silence had just become the most dangerous thing she carried. The morning rounds hit different when someone's decided you don't belong there. Danielle was finishing discharge instructions with the Morales family in bed 7, 2 hours of explaining medication schedules, demonstrating how to change the sterile dressing on Mrs. Morales' surgical site, arranging transportation to their follow-up appointment at Duke. The daughter translated for the parents in Spanish. Everyone understood. Everyone was ready to go home. Danielle was walking them toward the elevator when Dr. Hargrove's voice cut across the floor loud enough for the entire hallway to hear. "Nurse Ross, you failed to document the discharge protocol checklist again. This is the 3rd time this month." She stopped. Didn't turn around. Let that land. The checklist was completed at 08 for 7, Dr. Hargrove. It's in the system under the correct timestamp. But he was already moving to the patient assignment board, grabbing a red marker, writing her name in letters big enough that it looked like a warning. Mrs. Morales looked back, confusion flickering across her face, the same face that had thanked Danielle 5 minutes earlier, had squeezed her hand and called her La Enfermera Buena, the good nurse. Now she looked uncertain. Ashamed, maybe, as if Danielle's competence had somehow been the family's mistake to believe in. Hargrove laved her off like she was a distraction from his day. Danielle took one measured breath. Felt something hot escape the corner of her left eye. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her hand steady as surgical steel, and nodded at Mrs. Morales. "Your prescription is at the pharmacy downstairs. Call if anything changes." Professional. Invisible again. The family left in silence. The break room became a predictable geography of rejection. 3 days running, Danielle would sit down with her sandwich at the same plastic table, unwrap it carefully, and within 90 seconds the room would empty. Not obviously. Never obviously. Carla, the nursing assistant, would suddenly remember she hadn't restocked the supply cart. Janet from the afternoon shift would get an urgent page. The 2 residents would realize they'd forgotten to check on a lab result. The exodus was choreographed like muscle memory, everyone moving simultaneously, avoiding her eyes, leaving her alone with the humming refrigerator and the sound of their laughter drifting from the supply room next door. Danielle would sit there anyway. Would eat her sandwich. Would not flinch. But her hands learned to shake in private, gripping the edge of the table when no one was watching. Her jaw developed a permanent tension, a clenching that made her molars ache. The isolation was precise, surgical in its execution, not crude enough to document, just effective enough to be felt. It was the kind of bullying that only worked if you had institutional power to back it up. If you were the medical director. If your authority was unquestioned. Carla wouldn't make eye contact anymore. When they passed in the hallway, the nursing assistant found sudden interest in her phone, her shoes, literally any point in space that wasn't Danielle's face. The teaching rounds on Thursday morning were designed to be public execution. Hargrove circled the department with 4 medical students trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. He stopped at a patient Danielle was monitoring, a post-op cardiac case, stable, labs trending right, vitals clean. "Nurse Ross, walk us through your assessment of this patient's fluid status." She began, voice level. 24-hour I and OS are balanced, urine output adequate, CVP is no. You're looking at the wrong indicators entirely. He turned to the students, his smile cutting. This is basic nursing competence, people. Florence Nightingale here seems to have forgotten her fundamentals. One of the students smirked. The other shifted, uncomfortable but complicit. Danielle's hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. She simply stepped back and let him have the floor, let him demonstrate his superiority for the students, let him prove that he was the smart one and she was just an obstacle in a uniform. That afternoon, Hargrove called her into his office. The door closed. The blinds were already drawn. He held up a medication inventory sheet, his expression all false concern. "Danielle, we've had a discrepancy in the dilaudid count. 2 vials short from the last 24 hours. I need to understand how that happened." She felt her body cool. Opioid accountability was federal. Any error on controlled substances became a report, a file, a permanent mark. She knew what this was. She recounted the drawer herself that evening, her hands moving through the vials with methodical precision. The logs matched perfectly. 0900 opening count, 42 vials. Every administration documented. 2100 closing count, 42 vials. The math was clean. She went back to his office the next morning. "I've recounted that dilaudid drawer 3 times, Dr. Hargrove, and the logs match perfectly, but I'll be happy to do it a 4th time with a witness present." She kept her voice the temperature of ice water. Kept her eyes level. Didn't flinch. Didn't look away. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of someone whose game had rules he controlled, and she just declined to play by them. "That won't be necessary. Just be more careful, Florence." The nickname spread through the department like infection. By Friday, it was embedded in the culture. Florence. As if she were Victorian, antiquated, fundamentally incompetent. As if her name wasn't worth remembering. But that wasn't the worst part. Wednesday night, 2147 hours. The ambulance bay doors crashed open and Danielle was restocking Trauma Bay 3 when the paramedics wheeled in a man who made her entire body go rigid. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb. Her son Jason's commanding officer. The officer who'd mentored her boy through his first deployment in Helmand Province, who'd sent Jason home with stories of leadership and grace under fire, who represented the kind of honor she'd left behind when she walked away from the Navy. Webb was conscious and pale, his hand pressed against his upper left chest, 2 junior Marines flanking the stretcher like sentries. Construction accident, the paramedics reported. Rebar through the upper chest, bleeding controlled in the field, possible pericardial involvement given the trajectory. Vitals were holding but concerning. Webb's eyes were sharp despite the pain, the eyes of someone used to reading situations and people. He didn't recognize Danielle. She was just another nurse, another face in the system. That was the point of the civilian job, after all. No one knew. No one asked. No one expected Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross to be anything but invisible, pushing meds and checking monitors in a hospital in North Carolina where her past belonged to a different woman entirely. Danielle guided the stretcher into Trauma Bay 2. Her hands moved through the assessment without hesitation. Troponin drawer, 12 lead EKG, portable chest X-ray. The wound tract concerned her, entered at the second intercostal space, trajectory suggesting potential cardiac involvement. Webb needed intervention fast if this was what she suspected. Dr. Hargrove arrived and took the case personally, which was unusual. Normally he delegated trauma to the junior attendings. But Danielle watched him make a phone call from the physician station, his body language agitated, his voice low and urgent. She caught fragments, VIP case, needs transfer to Duke, billing codes. Understanding arrived quietly, the way it always did. Webb wasn't a patient to Hargrove. Webb was financial potential. Webb was a case that needed management. Webb was something to control. And Danielle was the problem who'd seen something she wasn't supposed to see. At 20:31 hours, the front entrance erupted with shouting. The automatic doors slammed open and a man entered who belonged in a different kind of emergency entirely. 300 pounds of muscle and trauma, bleeding from a laceration on his forearm, eyes wild with something that wasn't quite present. His name was Tommy Vickers and he was in full PTSD flashback, screaming about Taliban in the walls, about IEDs, about brothers who weren't breathing anymore. He was swinging a 4-foot length of rebar like it was a carbine, like he was back in some desert clearing house to house, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead in that moment before chaos becomes inevitable. A plastic chair flew into the reception desk and shattered. The security guard backed away. A resident ran. 2 nurses dove into exam rooms and slammed the doors. The waiting room scattered like startled birds, everyone moving away from the man with the metal bar and the 1,000-yard stare. Everyone moved away except Danielle, who was walking directly toward him. Her hands visible. Her posture open. Her voice dropping into a register she'd sworn she'd never use again. The voice that had commanded 42 people through an ambush in Marja. The voice that had held order when the world was breaking. "You have no idea who you're standing next to," she said quietly, the words meant only for Vickers, meant to cut through his flashback like a tether. That wasn't the worst part. That was the moment everything changed. Wednesday night at 2147 hours, the trauma bay doors burst open and Tommy Vickers stumbled through like something feral had been hunting him across the city. 300 pounds of muscle and blood and terror, construction accident victim turned ghost-haunted nightmare. His arm was shredded from elbow to wrist where rebar had caught him, but that wasn't what had him screaming. His eyes were somewhere else entirely. Somewhere in Helmand province where the dust never settled and the walls had eyes. Get down, incoming." His voice cracked the fluorescent silence like a rifle shot. He was swinging the length of rebar he'd carried in like a weapon, wide arcs that sent the attending resident diving behind a medication cart, sent 2 nurses scrambling backward, sent the ER into that specific kind of controlled chaos that meant everyone was calculating exits. Dr. Hargrove was already 10 paces back, phone pressed to his ear, his face flushed with the color of a man accustomed to authority that was suddenly meaningless. "Security to Trauma Bay 4, we have an active threat, I repeat, active threat." The rebar whistled through the air where a resident's head had been 3 seconds prior. Danielle was at the medication station restocking full lines when it happened. She didn't run. She didn't calculate exits or reach for the panic button or retreat behind counters like everyone else. She set down the box of 18-gauge needles with deliberate care and turned toward the sound. Her eyes took in the man, the wound, the wild expression, the way his body was moving in patterns that had nothing to do with present-day Raleigh and everything to do with muscle memory and trauma that had dug so deep it was running him now like a puppet master. She moved directly toward him. Hands visible. Palms forward. The other staff members stared at her like she was walking into traffic with her eyes closed. "Step back," someone called from behind a counter. Danielle didn't acknowledge them. She was already crossing the distance, her movements unhurried, her posture open but grounded in a way that made the air pressure change, like a door opening on something dangerous but under control. Tommy Vickers saw movement and raised the rebar higher, his face twisted with something that looked like rage but was actually terror wearing a borrowed face. "Stay back. Stay back or I will," his voice broke on the threat. His hands were shaking. The rod wavered in the air like a terrible conductor's baton. Danielle was 5 paces away now, and she opened her mouth and spoke in a voice she had sworn 18 years ago she would never use again. The voice from Marja. The voice from convoy ambushes and open chest wounds and the moment when language was the only tourniquet you had. The voice of Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, Field Commander, now pretending to be nobody at all. Marine. Not a question. A statement of fact that cut through the fog. "Eyes on me. What's your name and rank?" The authority in those 7 words was like dropping a thermite charge into ice water. Tommy's gaze snapped to her face. His shoulders lowered a fraction of an inch. "Corporal. Corporal Tommy Vickers, sir, His breath was coming in ragged bursts. The rebar was still raised but the arc had narrowed, the momentum had slowed. "Vickers. Good. Report, Corporal. How many wounded?" She was 10 feet away now, closing the distance with each measured step. Her voice carried the specific cadence from de-escalation training that wasn't taught in civilian EMT courses, the precise phrasing that acknowledged the threat without reinforcing it, that made the human brain behind the PTSD episode start to surface. There were 6, no 7, you did your job, Corporal. You held the line. You kept them alive. She was 7 feet away. But you're not in Marja anymore. You're not in Helmand Province. This is Raleigh, North Carolina, and the firefight is over. You're home. I need you to report your injuries and let me treat that arm. The rebar was wavering now, the grip loosening. Tommy's face was starting to crumble, the rage dissolving into the raw confusion of a man watching the walls of his flashback come down. He looked at the rebar in his hands like he'd never seen it before. Like he couldn't quite remember why he was holding it. The walls, he whispered. They're in the walls are clean, Marine. Clear the room. You cleared it. You're safe. Danielle was 5 feet away now, close enough that she could see the lucidity starting to return behind his eyes, that specific moment when the present overtook the past. I need you to set down your weapon and let me treat you. The rebar fell. It hit the tile floor with a sound like a period at the end of a long sentence, and then Tommy Vickers collapsed forward like his strings had been cut. All 300 pounds of him went down, and Danielle caught him, the motion so automatic, so practiced, that no one watching understood it had been rehearsed 1,000 times in different uniforms under different skies. She guided him to the floor with a kind of efficiency that spoke to experience beyond any civilian medical credential, her voice shifting down to something soft, something that was holding him together piece by piece. I've got you, brother. You're safe. I've got you. The ER held its breath. The entire room had gone so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the ICU 1 floor up, could hear the rain starting to hammer the windows, could hear the heart monitor across the room continuing its steady beep 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 like the only sane thing left in the world. Dr. Hargrove was staring at her with an expression that cut between confusion and something darker, something more calculating. His phone was still pressed to his ear, but he'd stopped talking to whoever was on the other end. He was watching Danielle work with the casualness of someone assessing a threat, watching her move with certainty and authority that didn't match the invisible nurse he'd been spending 6 weeks breaking down. She'd just revealed something he couldn't categorize, and Danielle felt the moment he made the decision, the way his eyes shifted from concern to strategy, the way his jaw tightened. That was the moment he understood he had a problem that couldn't be solved by public mockery or pharmacy pressure or carefully orchestrated professional humiliation. That was the moment he started calculating how to bury her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she had no time to process the danger she'd just stepped into because the monitor above the bed in Trauma Bay 3 started screaming. Dr. Hargrove had brought in a patient 30 minutes earlier, a construction supervisor named Webb with a stab wound to the left chest wall, bleeding that had seemed manageable under pressure dressings, vitals that had been stable, almost stable, steady enough that the other residents had been discussing admission versus observation. Danielle knew him. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb. Her son's commanding officer. The man who'd mentored Jason through his first deployment, who'd written letters of recommendation for his promotion, who'd been there for the phone calls home when the weight got too heavy. She'd pretended not to recognize him when he came through those doors, had kept her face neutral and her voice professional and her hand steady, because acknowledging that she knew this man would have meant explaining why she had that kind of connection, and explaining that connection would have meant exposing everything. Now his blood pressure was collapsing. The monitor was showing it in real time, 97/63, dropping, 91/58, the slope accelerating. His jugular veins were distending. His breathing was becoming shallow. The telltale signs of cardiac tamponade, the pericardial sac filling with blood, compressing his heart, stealing away his cardiac output 1 beat at a time. He had maybe 3 minutes. Maybe 4 if he was lucky. Any longer and they'd be calling it. The resident who'd been standing nearest to his bed was frozen in that way that medical training sometimes failed to prepare people for, when the crisis was real and immediate and the manual didn't have a chapter for being terrified. Dr. Hargrove was already moving, but moving in the direction of the phone again, already calculating how this would reflect on his department, already preparing his narrative. Danielle was across the room in seconds, leaving Tommy Vickers to the nurses who were now emerging from their hiding places, leaving the chaos and the confusion and the rebar on the floor. She was already assessing, already moving with hands that had done this before under conditions that made a trauma bay look like a Sunday afternoon prayer service. I need a 14-gauge angiocath needle, a 10-milliliter syringe, and a sterile field, she said, her voice back to that low command register. Someone get me a monitor with output on the wall where I can see it, and move the light over here. The resident who'd been frozen unfroze. Do we call cardiothoracic? Do we prep for? Do what I said, Danielle replied, and her voice was the kind that didn't leave room for negotiation. She was already prepping his chest, already identifying the landmarks, already seeing through the blood and the skin to the pericardial space beneath. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser, and no one in that room understood that they were watching someone with no business being in a civilian hospital perform a procedure that required the kind of training you got in combat medical operations, in mobile hospitals built in forward operating bases, in the seconds before a casualty became a fatality. The needle went in at the 5th intercostal space, midclavicular line. 60 milliliters of blood aspirated from the pericardial sac in one smooth motion. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to dim as her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd performed this procedure under mortar fire, who'd learned anatomy not from textbooks but from keeping casualties alive in forward operating bases where the difference between life and death was measured in seconds and steady hands. Webb's pressure climbed immediately. 85. 90. 92. The monitor's rhythm steadied from the chaotic electrical storm back into something resembling a heartbeat. His eyes fluttered open, and for one suspended moment, he looked directly at her. Confused recognition flickered across his face like a light trying to stay lit. "Do I know you?" She didn't answer. She was already disposing of the needle, already stepping back, already invisible again. Dr. Hargrove stood frozen at the foot of the bed, his face the color of spoiled milk. He'd watched the entire procedure unfold and understood in that moment what everyone else in the room was still processing, that the quiet nurse in the corner had just performed a life-saving intervention with a level of competence that didn't belong to anyone with her credentials, that something about her didn't add up, that she represented a threat far more dangerous than her file suggested. He activated his network at 2,300 hours that same night. The first call was to Jonathan Pierce, the hospital board's chief administrator, a man Hargrove had known for 15 years through golf club connections and charity galas. "John, we have a serious problem at Mercy General. An employee with concerning mental health indicators just performed unauthorized medical procedures on a critical patient. I'm talking about an unstable individual with a dangerous savior complex who's been exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior." Hargrove's voice carried the practiced tone of someone sharing confidential concerns, not fabricating them. "I'm worried about liability. I'm worried about patient safety. She needs to be removed before something worse happens." By 0100 hours, Hargrove had contacted the North Carolina Board of Nursing with a formal complaint citing credible concerns about mental fitness for duty, a vague accusation that was difficult to disprove and impossible to ignore. He alleged that Danielle had shown signs of PTSD-related instability, that she'd been observed having what he called dissociative episodes, that her intervention on the patient in the trauma bay demonstrated poor judgment and unauthorized treatment outside her scope of practice. At 0230 hours, he called in a favor from a risk management investigator named Richard Kellerman, a man who'd worked with Hargrove on 3 previous cases and understood the nuances of building a credible-looking file. By the time Danielle clocked out at 0600 hours, wearing her wrinkled scrubs and carrying the invisible weight of a decade she'd never spoken aloud about, Kellerman had already begun drafting the suspension notice. The letter was waiting in her locker by 0630 hours, printed on official hospital letterhead and signed by the medical director. Suspension effective immediately. Notice to appear before a disciplinary board. Citation for gross procedural violations, unauthorized treatment, and credible concerns about mental fitness for duty. She read it once. Then again. The words blurred together like they were written in a language that almost made sense. Her hands, those same hands that had just saved a man's life with surgical precision, began to tremble. The tremor started small, just a flutter in her fingers, but it climbed up through her wrists and into her forearms. She gripped the edge of the metal locker and forced it down, forced all of it down, the way she'd been trained to do. But the mask was cracking. For the first time in 7 years, the carefully constructed civilian identity of Danielle Ross, RN, was fracturing along fault lines she didn't know how to repair. She changed in the empty locker room. Her jacket felt heavier than it should as she pulled it on, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the one that had touched her skin through hundreds of shifts. She picked up her badge, the one that now marked her as a liability, and left it on the bench. The lowest point came at 1,420 hours that afternoon. Jason found her at the kitchen table in street clothes, still in yesterday's makeup, the suspension letter spread in front of her like evidence at a crime scene. She wasn't crying silently the way strong women cry in movies, with dignity and a single tear. She was crying the way someone cries when the last wall they've built gets breached, shoulders heaving, face in her hands, the kind of crying that comes from a place so deep it takes everything with it. 7 years of pretending. 7 years of being invisible. 7 years of telling herself that if no one knew, then it didn't matter. Jason stood in the doorway for 10 seconds before she noticed him. "Mom? Why are you home? What happened?" She couldn't look at him. Couldn't find words that wouldn't detonate the entire structure of her life. "I made a mistake at work." "What kind of mistake?" His voice had that edge it got when he was scared, the same edge it had when he was 12 and asked if she was going to die when she deployed. When she deployed? When she was someone else entirely. The kind they don't forgive. She kept her face down, her voice steady enough that it might have sounded normal to someone who didn't know her. But Jason knew her. Jason had watched his unbreakable mother be broken once before, 7 years ago, when she came home from Marja changed and silent, when the laugh she used to have just disappeared like it had never existed. He couldn't watch it happen again. He didn't sleep that night. At 0300 hours, while Danielle lay awake in the dark, Jason climbed into the attic through the access panel in his bedroom closet. He'd been forbidden from going up there since he was old enough to understand the concept of not yours. But right now, his mother was sitting at a kitchen table like someone had hollowed out her insides, and he was going to find out why. The boxes were sealed with duct tape and stacked in the far corner, behind the water heater, behind old Christmas decorations nobody used anymore. He pulled them toward the beam of his phone's flashlight. His hands were shaking. The second box had something wedged underneath it, a shadow box, wood frame, felt backing, sealed behind glass that hadn't been opened in years. Inside, a medal on a ribbon. A second medal. A photograph of his mother in naval dress uniform with the name tape Ross visible above the breast pocket, standing with men who had the same expression she had, the look of people who'd seen things. And a citation. Official. Government seal. Words like extraordinary heroism under fire, Marja, Afghanistan, direct enemy contact sustained for 4 hours, Navy Cross for Valor. Jason's hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the box. The disciplinary hearing convened at 0900 hours the next morning in the board conference room on the 3rd floor of Mercy General. Danielle sat alone at a table facing 8 board members, the hospital's legal counsel, and Dr. Hargrove, who looked precisely as confident as a man who'd made 24 phone calls and activated 3 separate networks to ensure this outcome. The board chair, a woman named Margaret Chen, opened the file. "Ms. Ross, we're reviewing your suspension based on several serious allegations regarding unauthorized medical procedures and concerns about your mental fitness." The door opened. A 17-year-old boy walked in carrying a shadow box like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He was pale, shaking, dressed in his school uniform and raw determination. "I'm sorry, this is a closed hearing," Margaret Chen started, but Jason's voice cut through hers. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross." His voice cracked on every word. "And I found out why she can't sleep. I found out why she cries. I found out what she won't tell me." He set the shadow box on the table. Danielle closed her eyes. "Jason, no." Margaret Chen picked up the medal with trembling fingers. Her voice shook as she read aloud, "Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. Defense Superior Service Medal." She looked up. This is a Navy Cross. In a civilian employee's file. That means. She couldn't finish the sentence. The conference room door opened a second time. Commander Seth Driscoll walked in wearing full dress uniform, rank insignia catching the overhead lights like warning signals. He was a man built from the same composure Danielle had carried for 7 years, and his presence changed the air pressure in the room. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Marie Ross served 16 years in Naval Special Operations. The procedure she performed last night? Pericardiocentesis under combat conditions? That's advanced trauma surgery performed in field hospitals while under direct fire. She earned the Navy Cross saving lives when her entire unit was pinned down in Marja. She held a Marine's aorta closed with her hands for 90 minutes waiting for medevac. Dr. Hargrove's face had turned grey. His hands gripped the edge of the table. She left service voluntarily after that deployment due to invisible wounds, Driscoll continued, his voice like a tank idling in an underground garage, low and heavy. She asked us never to reveal her service. She came here to heal in anonymity. And you suspended her for saving a life. A third voice came from the doorway. Female. Federal tone. I'm Special Agent Maria Morrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Dr. Hargrove, we need to discuss your unauthorized access to classified military service records last night using hospital credentials. That's federal computer fraud. The financial investigation into Mercy General's phantom billing codes has now expanded to include witness intimidation and evidence tampering. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilation system cycling, the distant beep of monitors in the ICU, the sound of a career ending in real time. Dr. Hargrove stood up. His face was the color of dead tissue. I think my attorney should be present for any further conversation. But the damage was done. The walls had come down. The carefully constructed anonymity of Danielle Ross, RN, had been shattered in a conference room on the 3rd floor of a hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina, and everyone in that room understood that they'd just learned the name of someone far more important than they'd ever realized. Jason found her at the kitchen table at 2 in the afternoon, still wearing her street clothes, a cup of cold coffee untouched in front of her. Her shoulders moved in a way he'd never seen before, not the controlled breathing of someone managing stress, but the raw, unguarded heaving of someone whose armor had finally cracked. When he asked why she was home early, why she was sitting in the dark with the kitchen blinds closed, Danielle opened her mouth to answer. Nothing came. The words were all connected to other words, and those words led to things she'd kept buried for 18 years, and if she pulled on one thread, the entire story would unravel across this kitchen table like classified documents spilling onto tile. She just shook her head. Jason didn't push. He went upstairs and found the attic access. He found the shadow box in the 3rd storage container, the one marked winter clothes, hidden beneath sweaters that hadn't been worn since before he was born. When he opened it, his hands began to shake. The hospital board meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning. Jason showed up at 8:45, the shadow box under his arm, his mother still at home, still sitting at that kitchen table. The board members were arranged around a mahogany conference table, the hospital administrator, 2 physicians, the chief of nursing, 3 community board members, and Dr. Hargrove, who was mid-sentence when Jason walked in. She's unstable, Hargrove was saying. The incident with the patient in crisis, her response was disproportionate, and frankly, I have concerns about her mental health. Jason set the shadow box on the table. The room went dead silent. He opened it with trembling hands, and medals caught the fluorescent light like small trapped suns. A Navy cross lay mounted on navy silk. 2 silver stars below it. Purple heart ribbons. A Defense Superior Service Medal. Citations printed on gold embossed cards. The room understood immediately that they were looking at something that didn't belong in a nurse's personnel file. That these medals belonged to someone else. That someone else had been walking their corridors the entire time. My mother, Jason said, his voice cracking on the second word, is Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. The words hung in the air like a defibrillator charging. She served 12 years. 3 combat tours. And she never told any of you because she thought that life was over. The board chair, a woman named Patricia Voss who'd reviewed Danielle's hiring paperwork 5 years ago without asking questions about the minimal military history listed, reached for the shadow box with trembling hands. She opened one of the citation folders. Her voice, when it came, was thin as paper. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism and valor in combat operations in Marja, Helm and Province, February 2009. While serving as senior medical officer for a special operations convoy, then Master Chief Petty Officer Ross provided emergency trauma care under direct enemy fire, performing emergency procedures with complete disregard for her own safety. She paused, her finger tracing the official Navy seal at the bottom. For saving the lives of 16 personnel during an ambush that resulted in. Patricia's voice stopped. She didn't need to finish. The implications were already filling the room like smoke. The door opened without a knock. A man in Navy dress blues entered, commander's insignia on his shoulders, the kind of presence that made the air pressure in a room change. Commander Seth Driscoll, head of Naval Special Warfare Group 2, walked to the table like he owned it. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross received the Navy Cross, he said, his voice level and authoritative, for actions in Marja. She earned 2 silver stars in separate operations. The Defense Superior Service Medal for leadership of a 16-person combat medical element under sustained fire. He pointed at the citations. She saved 16 lives under direct fire when her convoy was ambushed. I was there. I watched her work on a torn artery with rifle rounds hitting the vehicle around her, and she never stopped. Not for a second. The board members were leaning back in their chairs like the words themselves were pushing them away. An FBI agent stepped forward from the corner of the room where he'd been standing quietly. Special Agent Morrison, 6 months into an investigation that had started with anomalies in Mercy General's billing records. Dr. Hargrove, Morrison said, we have evidence that you attempted to access and alter Ms. Ross's military records using hospital credentials at 01:47 hours last night. He extended a tablet showing login records, IP addresses, timestamps. You attempted to create a narrative of dishonorable discharge. To erase her. Hargrove's face was the color of old blood. We've been investigating phantom equipment orders at this facility for 6 months. Inflated supply costs. Medical device kickbacks. Someone was stealing, and when a quiet nurse started double-checking requisitions. When she showed the kind of attention to detail that threatened to expose what you were doing, you decided to eliminate her instead of stopping the fraud. Morrison's voice had the weight of federal authority behind it. Approximately $2.3 million in fraudulent billing, Dr. Hargrove. And you used federal systems to attack a decorated veteran. That's computer fraud. That's tampering with military records. That's witness intimidation under USC 18. 2 more agents moved into position. Hargrove stood up. His voice came out strange, cracked at the edges. She was nobody, he said. She was just a quiet nurse who didn't belong here. She was Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross, Commander Driscoll interrupted, his voice quiet in a way that made the room smaller. And you were too small to see it. The handcuffs clicked. The perp walk through Mercy General's main corridor that morning was the kind of moment that gets told and retold in hospital break rooms for years. Day shift nurses watched from the emergency department. Residents whispered. The nursing assistant who wouldn't make eye contact with Danielle in the hallway stood motionless as Dr. Hargrove passed, his face the color of ash, his carefully built authority walking out of the building in federal custody. The staff who'd shunned her at lunch, who'd smirked during rounds, who'd believed his fabricated accusations, they all watched. They all understood. They had been wrong about someone, and that person had just been revealed as something they couldn't comprehend. Danielle stood in the trauma bay where everything had changed, where a giant with wild eyes had come through the door's swinging steel, where she'd walked directly toward him when everyone else ran. Jason was beside her. Commander Driscoll was on her other side. The letter from Lieutenant Colonel Webb, the one she'd been holding since his discharge that morning, was folded in her pocket next to the unit patch she'd kept sewn into her jacket lining for 18 years. Senior Chief, Driscoll said, Navy Medicine Training Command is establishing a combat trauma program here in Raleigh. We need someone to develop curriculum and teach the next generation of combat medics. Full rank restoration. Full benefits. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the last FBI vehicle disappear from the parking lot. "I walked away from the Navy because I thought I was broken," she finally said. Her voice had changed. It no longer asked for permission. It stated facts. "I thought staying invisible would keep me safe. I thought that running from who I was meant I could escape what I'd seen." She turned to face Driscoll directly. "I was wrong." "Is that a yes, Senior Chief?" "That's a yes, Commander." 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Hargrove at a community college annex in North Raleigh, teaching CPR certification to teenagers who didn't know his name used to mean something. He made $15 an hour. His medical license was permanently revoked. Federal charges resulted in 4 years of prison time, with restitution pending. The fraud investigation expanded to include 2 other administrators and a medical device company executive. Mercy General implemented new oversight procedures. The phantom billing stopped. And on the first day Danielle taught her inaugural combat medicine course at Naval Hospital Camp Lejeune, 42 young medics filed into a classroom where a woman in Navy dress blues with Senior Chief insignia on her sleeve wrote on the whiteboard, "Pain is data. Shock is physics. Keep the patient alive." They didn't know they were standing in front of a Navy Cross recipient. They didn't know the woman teaching them had performed emergency surgery under fire. They just knew, within the first 5 minutes, that they were in the presence of someone who understood something essential about survival. The legends come later. The story of the quiet nurse who walked toward the threat. The story of the decorated officer who chose to hide. The story of what happens when the truth finally emerges and the world recalibrates itself around someone it had completely misunderstood. Tommy Vickers, the former Marine she'd talked down in the trauma bay, was enrolled in her class. He recognized her uniform before class started. When she caught his eye, she nodded. That was all. A recognition of what they'd survived together in that moment when everyone else had run. Danielle stood in the hospital parking lot at the end of her first week, uniform crisp, unit patch visible now on her service dress. No longer hidden. No longer anything but what she'd always been. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. But sometimes, when you walk back into the light, the world finally sees you for what you've always been. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe for more tales of quiet strength and hidden valor. Share this with someone who deserves to know they're stronger than they believe. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever underestimated someone only to discover they were far more than you imagined?